Welcome to
Just a Bit Outside.
Today, we're going to talk about something a little bit different. This is from Facebook where I notice this a lot. Now, it happened with me also. I was looking through posts with different friends, people that I barely knew or didn't know. But over and over, one of the things I saw that a lot of us lost people that we loved this year. I can name 3 people personally that I lost. Now, a lot of times, we're going to mourn losing these people. That's obvious. But I thought, we also need to celebrate them. After all, why do they call it a celebration of life ceremony? So what I decided to do was a good way to do this is just tell stories about some of these people that we've known and loved over the years. And everybody has a funny story about at least 1 or 2 people that they knew that they lost. So I decided, some of these stories are worth sharing. So I'm going to share with some of these stories, and hopefully you'll get a good laugh out of it. Hopefully it'll help you to remember with somebody that you've lost personally. Maybe it'll kick in some great memories. So the first person we're going to talk about is Randy Warwick. Now, Randy was my roommate out in Colorado Springs. He worked for a church. He was a really good guy. He was not the kind of person that had a lot of friends, but he was a really good guy, the people who knew him. Really big guy. I really enjoyed talking to him. He loved sports. He originally was from Boston, so he loved the Red Sox. And one of the things I do remember happening was I had just moved out there from being down here in Florida, and that was back when the Rays were a brand new team. And that first year, I went to see at least 20 games before I moved out to Colorado. So I put a race schedule up on my door, I taped it, and it was just to kind of keep track of how they were doing that year. I wanted to know just, how they were doing. Well, Randy, this was with the beginning of a new season. He walked over one day while I was at work, and he's looking at the schedule, and he pulled out a pen, and every game where he played, he did a little L, L, L. Well, they played 18 times that year, so there were 18 L's on my new pocket calendar on my door. So, but here was the other thing, is before he became a Christian, when he was growing up, he did also do some things that, stupid kids would do. And one of them was he would burglarize homes. So he told me this story about how he broke into a home, and he's in this house planning to burglarize it when all of a sudden the owner of the house wakes up, and this guy comes out with a shotgun, comes flying down the stairs. Well, this terrifies Randy. He doesn't want to get shot. So he runs out of that house and he takes off, and he told me he hid under a van for 2 hours until that guy was gone. Now, the reason I thought this was kind of a funny story was, how many of us have ever heard a story from the other direction? Usually you'll hear it about from the police or the person that had the gun, but this was the person who actually was in the house that had to try to get away. His wife told me last night kind of a funny story also that she really laughed about. She said that what would happen is, he was driving his car one time, the car broke down, and he got out to push it. Well, this is Colorado, so you're talking about snow. It had just snowed, and obviously it was on a hill. The car started rolling. Well, what happened was, all of a sudden he's trying to stop it, and he can't. And this car gets away from him, rolls down the hill. He's running after it to catch his own car, Crown Victoria, and he slipped on some of the snow and fell, and this car plowed through a fence. How the end results were with the homeowner, I don't know, but it did plow through a fence. So that was Randy Warwick. Now, another person I'm going to talk about is John Fisher. John actually died in 2009, but he was a person I really, really enjoyed knowing. He was an older man. He would actually be 101 years old if he was alive today. But we volunteered at a prayer ministry together, and I really enjoyed just talking to John. And he would tell a lot of stories, but, I guess maybe being younger, I didn't sit there and think. So I started to tune him out. Old person story. Well, it dawned on me, maybe I need to listen to this story, because I realized, he was getting up there in years. I'm so glad he did, because the story he told me that I remember so clearly was about the 1939 New York World's Fair. He was 16 years old in 1939, going on 17. He's walking through and he saw exhibits from General Electric up there, like some kind of new radios. He talked about Oldsmobile had these new cars that were on display. There was all these different technological things that he was looking at. Now, by today's standards, yeah, old-fashioned, but this was history he was seeing before World War II even began. And he's sitting there telling me about it, so I'm so glad that I actually took the time to hear him, and he was definitely such a man of character. But that's one of the great stories I remember John telling me. Now, the one that I really want to talk about is Doyle. Doyle was a coworker of mine out in Colorado. Doyle was one of those people, if you knew him, it's guaranteed you were going to have a Doyle story. And everybody that knew Doyle in my circle of coworkers, we all had a Doyle story. So, this was a company where we did promotions with mainly oil changes, and we did them door to door. Doyle was really good at it. He knew how to sell. Now, one day Doyle was going through an apartment complex. He's knocking on doors, talking about the oil changes for these different shops that we're representing. He knocks on the door. This guy answers it, and Doyle starts to tell him what he's doing. This guy didn't like door-to-door salespeople at his door. So the guy rears back and throws a punch at Doyle. Doyle was 6'3", and he weighed over 300 pounds. This was a big guy. You're not just going to knock somebody like this over. So Doyle grabs him by the arm, flings him up against the wall, grabs him by the shirt, throws him down, and he's leaning over him, holding his shirt up like this. And Doyle, with his thick Amarillo, Texas accent, goes, "I was going to tell you how you could save money on some oil changes, but I'm not going to." And he walked off. Now, another Doyle story I have to tell. These both stories came directly from Doyle to me. Before I got part of this company, Network Advertising, Doyle had been with them for a while. They took a trip to Cabo San Lucas, which is down in Mexico on the Pacific Ocean. Doyle was in Amarillo. He had never even been to the Gulf of Mexico in Texas, let alone the Pacific Ocean in Mexico. So he gets down there, and he had never seen the ocean before, and he wondered what would it be like to look around and see nothing but water in any direction. And by the way, I had that happen with me one time out in California. I'm a landlubber. Well, Doyle decides he wants to see what it's like, so he rents his jet ski, and he fires it up, and he's just going further and further out, and he estimated to me that he probably was about 7 miles out. So he stops and he's looking around, and he's seeing almost nothing but water. He told me that in the distance he could see the mountains about that big. Just barely, he could barely see them. He shuts off the engine, and he's just sitting there on his jet ski looking around, just taking in the Pacific Ocean. And even though he was 6'3" and a big guy, this is the ocean. And all of a sudden he said something a lot bigger than him, and that jet ski appeared underneath him. And he didn't know what it was, but it scared the daylights out of him. He fired that jet ski up and got back to land as quick as he could. He did not look back. Anyway, anybody that knows Doyle, they're going to have a story like that. I could tell other stories, but then after that, we're going to go on to Mike Thibodeau. Now, a lot of you that are watching this up in Virginia, you probably knew Mike. Mike was a really good guy. Now, Mike was part of my growing up years. Part of the time we lived at Langley Air Force Base. Now, our neighborhood was right on the bay where we lived. Now, Mike, I think this is probably about junior high school, maybe about 7th grade. He loved to go fishing. His dad would go with him, and they just literally walked right over there, throw the line in, and they'd catch usually his croaker or things like that. Well, one day Mike caught a baby shark. And you need to understand Mike with that trademark laugh of his and that big, goofy, cocky grin, because Mike was the cockiest person that I possibly knew growing up. Here's this picture that he talked about for 10 days of him with this shark that was about this long and that big cocky grin that Mike was known for. Now, fast forward to high school. Now, high school, you know, everybody was really into partying in those days and things like that. So what happened was I threw this party at Horns Coliseum in, and there must have been 70 people showed up at least at one point. There were a lot of people came to that motel room that I'd rented. Well, what happened was Mike went to Hampton High School. Now, I was only at Hampton for a year, but after that, I had ended up at Bethel High School. So I had a friend from Bethel that had come to the party with me, a guy named Rob Dorch. Now, Rob was really into nunchucks. He loved playing these things and doing things like that. Well, Mike meets him at this party, and they're out in the parking lot, and Mike is just wanting to see these nunchucks, and he's fascinated with them. Now, here's the part of the story that I think what makes it funny is the fact that I didn't see what happened. I'm watching this go on between them about this fascination with the nunchucks and Rob playing with them, things like that. And I think Mike at one point did have the nunchucks, but after that, I don't know what happened because somebody tapped me on the shoulder. I turned to talk to them, and then all of a sudden I hear a thud. And everybody heard the thud, and we turn and we look, and there's Mike face down on the ground. So honestly, to this day, I still don't know what happened, but it was one of those things where I think that Mike was probably a little embarrassed, but it's one of those things that's just, yeah, that's a typical Mike memory. Incidentally, back in the 70s when President Gerald Ford was still in office, he came to speak at Langley Air Force Base. Now, I went with my dad because I wanted to hear him, and I did hear him give the speech, but here's the problem. There were thousands of people that showed up to hear him speak at Langley. So I could hear him speak, but you know, I'm in junior high school. I can't see above these people that are 6 foot tall. Well, Mike and his brother, and I think maybe somebody else with him, they got to the front of the line. So President Ford is going through there, and he's shaking everybody's hands. Mike reaches over to shake this president's hand, and he accidentally pulls off the watch. The watch falls to the ground, and it breaks. This is the President of the United States that Mike was shaking hands with. Mike is horrified. President Ford just looked down, he sees the watch, he looks at Mike, reaches down, he picked it up, put it in his pocket, waved him on, and away he went.
Just a bit outside.